It's been a big week for finance, and to discuss it, I'm joined by John Keogh, Economics Editor of the Australian Financial Review, and National Senator Matt Canavan. Great to have you both. Thank you so much for your time. Look, let's start with the RBA hiking rates for the 12th time this week, 12 rate rises. RBA boss Philip Lowe says that the wage rises, the Fair Work Commission approved rise in wage rises, would be fine if productivity is lifting at the same time. But there is a serious question over what the Labor government is doing or whether it's doing enough to lift productivity. John, why is this such an issue, and what can Labor do to actually play a part in any sort of quick time frame in boosting productivity growth?
Look, rising wages of around 3 to 4%, Sharri, normally when you're getting a bit of productivity growth is sustainable with the inflation target. But at the moment, we're starting to get an acceleration in wages and no productivity growth. It's been going on for about 3 years now. It's been a long, deep-seated problem even before that under the coalition government as well, but it's really got worse during the pandemic. And this is now putting upward pressure potentially on inflation and interest rates. So unless we get that productivity growth going again, wages will contribute to higher inflation, higher interest rates. And so,
but just on that point, what can Labor do to try and improve productivity, this year? I mean, it's such a long-term prospect.
Well, it is. And Jim Chalmers did rightly say this week he can't just snap his fingers and increase productivity overnight. But there's things that they maybe potentially shouldn't be doing that is probably going to make productivity even worse at the moment. That would be probably, most economists would say, their industrial relation changes that they've pushed through and planning to push through more. That's unhelpful. But then over the sort of years ahead where you actually make a positive difference on productivity, it's things like tax reform, slashing red tape, deregulation, making the economy more competitive as well. So businesses are facing more competition and pushing downward pressure on prices as well. But all that can't happen overnight. But the industrial relations changes are probably the biggest risk at the moment in the short term to the economy in terms of wage pressures.
Yeah. Look, we saw new data out yesterday that shows the economy grew by just 0.2% in the quarter to March. This is really concerning. Matt Canavan, you asked a question in Senate estimates just a few weeks ago about whether stagflation was a risk. You were told by senior Treasury officials that it was only a slight risk. Are you becoming more worried about stagflation in the second half of this year or even next year?
Well, I am if nothing's done about it. And I was a little surprised myself that the evidence was only a slight risk. I definitely think the probability of it is much higher than that. And the data, as you mentioned yesterday, shows that. I mean, we're only growing that 0.2% is only happening because we're importing about 2% extra people every year right now through our migration intake. So without that migration, we'd actually already be potentially in the recessionary zone. And of course, we've got very high inflation. So those two things together, high inflation, increasing unemployment or lower economic growth, means stagflation, and we don't want to see that. But they're not seeing a government that's trying to act and respond to this. I mean, the government basically has zero productivity agenda. Do you remember the job summit they had only 6 months or so ago? It seems like a lifetime away now. They didn't even invite the Productivity Commission along to that jobs summit. They're increasing taxes. They're regulating the energy markets. John's mentioned the industrial relations changes. There's no real agenda here to increase productivity, yet we had the absurd situation this week where we did have this productivity bomb, slow and stagnant economic growth, high inflation. We had this spectacle of the Treasury getting up saying his solution, what he's doing this week, what he's focused on, is banning cheques in 2030. I mean, where is Jim Chalmers' priorities right now, and why isn't he focused on doing what he can to help the Reserve Bank governor get inflation under control and lift productivity growth?
John, how worried are you about the economy and the risk of a potential recession, and not just in Australia, by the way, but globally in the second half of this year? I mean, that data yesterday that our economy grew by just 0.2%, is really concerning.
Yeah, I definitely think we're going to have a sharp slowdown that we all feel in the second half of this year and probably heading into next year. I mean, in a sort of brutal reality kind of way, we do need the economy to slow down quite a bit to bring inflation down. Unfortunately, that's going to mean unemployment ticking up a bit. hopefully, Philip Lowe says he can tread this narrow path to get the proverbial soft landing. But I've got to say, that's looking less and less likely now, the higher rates and inflation go. So we are at risk of having a harder landing. I still think it's possible we could have a soft one, but not as possible as it was, it maybe looked 6 months ago.
And what about this question? I mean, he talks about the narrow path and Jim Chalmers talks about not crunching the economy. But Matt, do you think we are looking at a situation where inflation could become entrenched at around the 5 to 6%, if it even gets to 5 to 6%?
Well, that is a concern, Sharri, and it's more of a concern because Jim Chalmers seems to be playing the role of a backseat driver here, not actually at the wheel. He is the treasurer, but every time I see him get up and speak, it's like he's simply like a weatherman, just giving a report on what economic conditions are like, and he always sort of has this bedside manner that everyone's doing it so tough and it's so terrible. But you're the guy in charge, so what are you doing to fix this issue? And they seemingly not caring or not doing anything to help restrain these wage price growth demands, which are understandable, but are potentially going to lead to this spiral where we do get inflation at a very high level for a long time, and that'll be bad for everybody.
Yeah. John, Bronwyn Bishop was on Sky News's The Front Page last night with Jenna Clark, and she said we haven't seen these sort of conditions in 30 years. I'm not sure if we have that comment. If we do, have a look at it.
I don't think we have seen for 30 years a more devastating time that we're starting to enter.
John, what do you think of that?
Well, I guess there is a risk we do head back to that sort of late 1980s situation where we have high inflation, high interest rates and high unemployment and a recession. But I mean, I would point out also right at the moment, unemployment's really low. It's only about 3.5%. There are some good things happening in the economy too, so we shouldn't be all in gloom. Doom and gloom, but there is definitely a risk of the trajectory of where we're heading.
Yeah, and that is the big difference, that we still at the moment have low unemployment. So if we can keep it there, Matt Canavan, I mean, I know the forecast is for it to increase, but we're not looking at the sort of levels we saw in the 80s or 90s.
Well, I go further back. I think it's more like the 1970s when at that time we had low unemployment, but we had a situation where energy prices were surging at the result then of the OPEC oil cartel being formed. We had a big spending government in the new Whitlam government that were completely blind to the pressures they were creating in the economy. And then we did kind of lose a decade in this country with high inflation, increasing unemployment, and generally going backwards in our competitiveness until the economic reforms of the 1980s. So that's what I think the risk is right here now, that we are kind of in this stage, maybe we're getting complacent, that things have been too good for too long, that we think it will just last forever. And that's where I worry that the government's at the moment. They're not taking seriously the risks here of high energy prices, high inflation, high wage demands, and a government and a treasurer that doesn't seem to be able to resist the demands of his high-spending ministers.
All right, National Senator Matt Canavan and Finance Editor, Economics Editor at the Australian Financial Review, John Keogh, thank you both very much for your insights tonight.